Hey everyone, welcome back to our movie news. Now today we are talking about Rebel Moon's official viewership numbers, and some will initially think that these numbers mean it's a failure, but I'm here to explain why that actually isn't the case. And no, this isn't me bending over backwards to try and make it seem like Rebel Moon is an amazing movie, and if you didn't like it, then your opinion is wrong. I don't even think the movie is amazing, and I think there are many things they could do to improve it. All I'm doing here is providing the factual evidence that Netflix has provided and what they deem as a success. So as you may know, Netflix release their streaming numbers every week to show their top 10 movies around the world and the number of views they have. And so when part 1 released, we were able to track the numbers weekly, and we can do the same for part 2 as well. So in Rebel Moon Part 2's first week, the movie managed to earn 21.4 million views. Now Netflix just releases these numbers weekly, even if a movie didn't release at the start of the week. So whilst this says April 15th to 21st, part 2 only came out on the 19th. So really, the movie made 21.4 million views in just 3 days, which is very good. But let's compare those numbers to part 1. Well, in part 1's first week, it earned 23.9 million views, and the film was supposed to come out on December 19th, however they moved it forward by a few hours, so it technically released on the 18th. So week 1's numbers are technically 7 days, but really it's probably around 6 days. Not a big difference, but still important context. So part 2 in its first week had 3 days less than part 1, but still managed to raise 21.4 million views compared to part 1's 23.9 million views. So whilst part 1 had 2.5 million more views than part 2, it also had 3 extra days to do it in. So for its first Netflix week, I think part 2 did very well. Only being 2.5 million views behind part 1 whilst having 3 less days is impressive and can't be understated. However, when it comes to its second week, then we can see a big decline. Part 1 managed to raise 34 million views in its second week, which is a huge increase on week 1, and that could be due to its second week occurring just after Christmas and a lot of people have free time, and that second week really helped the movie become a viewership success. However, part 2 has only managed to raise 18.8 million views in its second week, meaning after 2 weeks, part 1 had 57.9 million views and part 2 only has 40.2 million views. Now of course part 2 has 3 less days than part 1, but I don't think those 3 extra days would gain the movie 17 million more views. Because as with most movies, as we move further away from that film's release date, the viewership numbers tend to go down. The bulk of your viewership will happen within the first 2 weeks, and past that, it tends to drop quite dramatically. And I think that is what we are seeing already with part 2, and we saw it with part 1 in its third week, as it dropped to second place in the top 10 with only 11.1 million views in week 3. Now, if part 2 couldn't do what part 1 did with increasing its numbers in week 2, then I'm worried to see what week 3 will be like. A Child of Fire dropping to 11 million views wasn't good to see, but that movie had already earned 58 million views. So for part 2 to already be 17 million views behind the first film isn't good, and we are expecting an even bigger drop-off in week 3. I'm expecting week 3 to earn around 8 million views, unfortunately, so I would say these numbers are bad news for part 2. In the first 4 weeks of release, Rebel Moon Part 1 managed to earn around a total of 72.9 million views, and according to Nielsen's statistics, which are the most reliable sites for understanding streaming numbers, a high-budget Netflix original needs to cross 70 million views to be deemed as a success, meaning Rebel Moon Part 1 was a success, and since Part 2 has released, the views for Part 1 have also increased, pushing it back into the top 10 2 weeks in a row. In week 1 of the Scargiver's release, A Child of Fire gained an extra 5.5 million views, and in week 2, it gained another 6 million views, meaning that we know of, Rebel Moon A Child of Fire has a minimum of 84.4 million views. Now, you may not like the film, and that is completely fine, and you may look look at the reviews and think that is what makes Rebel Moon a failure, and that is fine too, but I don't think that is as significant to Netflix as you may think. Their goal is to keep users on the streaming service for as long as possible and to gain subscribers. And for $160 million, which normally gets you one big movie, Netflix are technically getting 4 big movies, with 2 of them already released and gaining a total of 124.6 million views. That is a lot of content for them. So whilst Part 2 on its own is doing worse than Part 1, which isn't good, the movie is still doing okay. And for the amount of money Netflix invested into these movies, they have got their money's worth from it already. They still have 2 director's cuts to release, and even if they make half the views the 2 cuts already released have earned, then Rebel Moon would have totaled around 186.9 million views. And that is great for Netflix. We can't deny though the clear lack of love the movies have had on review sites. Neither were loved on most review sites, but the fact the viewership numbers for these movies are high and people are rewatching Part 1 is the most important thing in my opinion. I think people need to realize that just because a minority of the total audience said they didn't like the movie on a website, that doesn't mean the movie was hated by most who watched it. Most of the general audience don't even vote on review sites. They just watch the movie and then go home, and if they liked it, they might watch it again or buy the DVD and will most likely watch the sequel when it comes out. Look at Michael Bay's Transformers films. All 5 of them were not loved by critics and audiences who voted on Rotten Tomatoes, yet all of them were box office successes, and 2 out of the 5 made over $1 billion each. You don't make that much money if everyone hated the film, and you definitely don't make more money on the next film if everyone hated the previous film. I love the Transformers movies. Some are better than others, but I just love them for what they are. Epic sci-fi action films with big explosions and cool music. Sometimes movies don't need to be more than that, and when they're promoted as exactly that, then what do you expect? The Transformers films were clearly enjoyed by the general public, otherwise they wouldn't have made 5 of them and made tons of money on every single one of them. But I don't think anyone would argue they are masterpieces, just epic action movies with cool sci-fi elements. Not every movie has to be a cinematic masterpiece to be enjoyed by the general audience. People who review films on websites tend to be far more invested in film, and so will have a different viewpoint than the general audience. And so it doesn't matter if a critic has said the movie is bad if the box office contradicts them. Which is why I have always thought Rotten Tomatoes is an irrelevant website, because all that really matters is how many people go and watch the movie and if the next film makes a similar amount or more. And if we apply that to Rebel Moon, sure, the reviews are low, especially from critics, but the viewership is high, and that is what matters. At least that's what I think. Now yes, Part 2 has lower numbers than Part 1, which is a surprise as I think most would agree that Part 2 was the better movie of the 2, even if you didn't like either of them. But the decrease could be due to Part 1 releasing during Christmas, and so more people will have more free time to watch it, inflating the numbers for Part 1, or maybe some people were disappointed by Part 1 and so decided not to bother watching the second film. And I think it may be both of those answers. Week 3 will definitely have even more of a decrease for The Scargiver, and I don't think Part 2 will reach the 70 million view threshold within 4 weeks. At its current trajectory, I can see it ending on around 55 million views after a month, and that would class the movie as a miss according to Nielsen's assessment. So it can't be classed as a hit, but I think a miss is a harsh assessment as it is still quite close to the threshold. In total, Netflix's $160 million investment would have given them over 120 million views split between 2 movies 4 months apart, and with 2 director's cuts being released at the end of summer. So I do think it was a good investment by Netflix. However, I do think there will be fears and hesitations with producing a 3rd movie. Even though the movies combined have very strong viewership numbers, the decrease from Part 1 to Part 2 will be concerning to them. Ideally, you want this to be the other way round. If Part 1 had the lower viewership numbers and part 2 had the higher numbers, then that would be very promising. It would have shown progress and a desire from the audience to see more. But due to it being the other way round, it looks like less people want Rebel Moon. Now, less doesn't mean none. Over 40 million views in less than 2 weeks is good, but compared to part 1, it's clear that something happened between the two films that made people not want to watch the second film. Whether that be disappointment in part 1, or only watching part 1 due to having extra time at Christmas, or not getting around to watching part 2 yet, or not wanting to watch part 2 a second time. Any of those reasons could be why part 2 has lower numbers than part 1. The point is, the decline is concerning, and with a new head of Netflix in charge in Dan Lin, who did jokingly say Snyder fans are bots, and who hasn't had that positive relationship with Snyder that Scott Stuber had when he was in charge, the reaction to this decline is unpredictable. Lin could see the decline and cancel any further stories for Rebel Moon, or he could greenlight a sequel and see how that does. We really don't know. I think we need to wait and see what happens with director's cuts. If those have more positive reactions to them and the views are similar to part 1's or higher, then I can definitely see Netflix making more Rebel Moon, but just sticking to Snyder's R-rated vision instead of making a PG cut. If the reaction towards them are more positive, but the views are low, then I still see them making more movies, but sticking to their current formula of a PG cut and a director's cut. But if the director's cuts have poor reactions to them and the views are low, then I really don't know what the future holds for Rebel Moon. Sure, the PG cuts will still have created a lot of views, but would that be enough for Netflix to make more? I honestly don't know, but what we do know is that part 1 was a viewership success, but part 2 probably won't be. Anyway, that is my breakdown on Rebel Moon's streaming numbers and my thoughts on what it means for the franchise. Make sure to let me know your own thoughts in the comments below. But that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a video. I hope to see you here again soon, so until then, have a great day. Bye!